Welcome to the Vietnamese Poetry Literature channel. Today we will listen to the Child work of author Thach Lam. Let's listen. Ms. Senator crouched under the heavy load of water, slipped through the door and entered with difficult and slow steps. The pole bent and groaned on his shoulder, the water in the barrel splashed with every step. She tried her best to climb up the steps, put the water bag on the ground, then used the hem of her shirt to wipe the sweat dripping from her forehead. "It's afternoon and you're still carrying water?" Ms. Senator leisurely took a moment before answering. "I have to carry water for him to bathe, but that's not enough. Since morning, there have been more than 10 loads of water." I shyly looked at her. "The river is far away, from home to the river you have to go a long way." Mrs. CA was stingy and refused to buy a single load of water from people in the market to sell, so she forced Ms. Sen to carry the burden all day long. I looked at her with pity, little sister with tanned skin. The limbs have been made ugly and barren by hard work. I was about to say something comforting to her, when suddenly there was a high-pitched voice, Mrs. Eldest's voice, from upstairs calling me down. "If you don't go, bring water for him to bathe while you stand there chatting. It's almost dark, what else?" I turned around to see Mrs. CA standing on the steps, her face frowning and angry. Ms. Sen was scared, quietly put her shoulder strap on her shoulder, and went out the door. I heard her sigh softly. After she left, I also returned, carrying Mrs. Elder's gaze behind me. She probably doesn't like me at all, but because I'm a descendant, she doesn't dare say anything. We, and everyone in them, do not like Mrs. Elder at all, but even hate her. I don't know if that hate is mixed with a bit of jealousy, because Mrs. CA is very rich, but every time her name is mentioned, everyone pouts with contempt. Mr. CA and his wife were also poor before. After that, thanks to lending at very high interest, he became rich. But she is very evil. With one hand, Mrs. CA confiscated countless fields of people in the area. She forced her to give to those who borrowed money, so her house always had chickens, ducks, rice or pig feet. But the miserly couple did not dare to eat chicken or duck, so they sold it at the market and left the pork leg to dry to save. The meal only had a little salty roasted sesame, a little braised meat and a plate of vegetables. The two of them often complained that they were having trouble living and were always unable to eat. Ms. Senator knows a lot about those meals because she often has to eat rice with salt. Many times when I come to visit, I see her sitting in front of a tray of rice with only an empty plate and a bowl of fish sauce. She ate lazily and leisurely like someone who couldn't eat, even though she was hungry. She said that rice with salt is very difficult to eat, swallowing it causes a lump in the throat. Ms. Sen is the daughter of a villager who owes money to her grandparents. I heard that because my teacher and I were running new, we had to go up and beg Mrs. CA to borrow $30. Half of the payment has been paid on harvest days with little interest, but the remaining half has not been paid, so Sen has to be assigned to live without pay. But Sen's mother kept talking. Mrs. CA generously agreed to give her 2 blouses, a long brown shirt and 2 pairs of oak pants for a year. Sen's mother thanked the creditor for his great kindness. She told her child to stay and serve Mr. and Mrs. Elder carefully, then went home. From then on, Ms. Senator took care of all the housework. Carry water, chop firewood, cook rice, stay awake all day, and still be scolded. Because Mrs. CA is a loud and talkative person. There was never a time when the neighbors did not hear her shrill and hissing, cursing at dogs, scolding cats, or scolding Ms. Sen. It's unfortunate for her to open her mouth and speak again. Immediately, Mrs. CA jumped up, gritted her teeth together, and screamed. "That damn thing is dead. You eat her food without working for her. Your father intends to eat without spoiling her, so she will have to raise your aunt." Ms. Senator mumbled. "Your teacher hasn't paid you yet." It's not like you're going to ignore the debt, but you're cursing, but she only muttered in her mouth, not daring to say it. At those times, the neighbors heard her voice and whispered to each other, "It's no wonder I don't have children. God gave me people like that," and they felt joy in their hearts like a miracle. Revenge. Mr. and Mrs. CA have no children. It was the most depressing. The couple are now old and no longer want anything. In the past, Mrs. CA used to run away from doctors to take medicine, worshipping at temples and shrines to pray for her baby's acne, but he grew weaker and weaker, while she continued to wither and wither like a dry tree, not giving birth at all. People in the family who hated her often said, "I don't know who should keep her wealth after being so exhausted." Those negative words reached Mrs. Saw's ears, perhaps making her angry. She hated her relatives even more, and did not like children coming to visit. Even though we came, she did not dare show her dislike. She is still sweet and gentle to us. Seeing us dressed in rags, she often asked, "Why don't you make healthy clothes for your children to wear, leaving them in tatters like this?" and turned back to tell her husband, "You spent so much money and left your children in such bad shape." Then she brought out people's food and distributed a few candies to each of us. Many times we had to throw them away because we couldn't eat them. 000. Ms. Senator has lived with Ms. CA for almost a year. That day, I heard the sound of Mrs. CA shouting for a long time, so I ran over. Ms. Sen was bowing her head into a pile of straw and crying. I asked why. She sobbed and replied, "I accidentally broke a cup, she hit me so hard." Ms. Sen's whole body was bruised, a mark from the whip across her lip made her bleed. She massaged and lamented, "Because my teacher is in debt, I have to suffer like this. So can I please go home?" Ms. Senator will shake her head and sigh, not speaking. Perhaps she thinks about the outstanding debt, and if the house cannot be paid, the house will be confiscated. A while ago, Sen's mother often came to talk to Mrs. CA. People say that Ms. Sen is about to ask to go home and get married. But whenever anyone asked, Mrs. CA answered, "Who will marry that rice and have children?" Then we saw that Ms. Senator had to curse and be beaten even more than before. After a while, Mrs. CA mentioned the money owed to berate her, saying that now she would chase her away, tomorrow she would chase her away, and would no longer take care of her, that bloated child who only likes to eat. We saw her crying all the time. Sang always saw her eyes red, or applying salt and hot water to the wounds caused by Mr. Elder's whip. In early August, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Senator come to serve Mrs. CA, carrying a basket with 2 chickens and a duck inside. Ms. Senator brought a bunch of bananas and a bunch of areca nuts, saying they got them from her garden. Meeting in the alley, my old nanny asked, "Where are you two going with so many gifts?" Teacher and Sister Sen replied, "We asked for her descendants to return home to get married." I ran to see. The 2 monks and sisters talked for a long time with Mr. and Mrs. Elder. Ms. Senator sat biting straw on the lower porch, next to the chicken and duck nest. She packed a few old, patched clothes in a square towel, along with a 3-cent comb, a small round mirror and a box of Miss Ba's wax. That was all she had. At noon, Sen's teacher took her over to greet my grandmother. She held the baby bundle under her arm, still wearing the brown shirt that was patched every day, but the kitchen smoke and sweat had darkened every spot. I noticed that the teacher's face was not as bright as when she arrived. At that time, his hands were empty. The gift must have been accepted by Mrs. Elder. He looked sad and disappointed. My grandmother congratulated Sen a few words, then asked, "How much money can Mrs. CA give as capital?" You and Sen replied, "Bam, I don't get any money." My family had to keep trying, but Mrs. CA finally stopped asking for interest this month. Teacher and Ms. Senator added, "Now I still have to pay for my grandchildren, I can't pay them back." My grandmother asked again, "And where are his new clothes?" "No, Mrs. CA didn't let her, saying she hadn't been here for exactly a year. Sen's voice was angry, then choked with tears. As for Ms. Sen, she has been standing quietly in the corner of the house, clutching a package of old clothes. A moment later, she quietly followed the teacher out. Her gait was slow and labored, as if she were still carrying a load of water on her shoulders. It was only 2 years later that I saw Ms. Senator again. That day, my teacher and my sister offered a bunch of bananas and a bunch of chickens to celebrate the new year with my grandparents, because the debt had not been paid off. Ms. Senator followed behind, but this time she was holding her son, her child. 3 people came in while Mr. and Mrs. CA were eating. Teacher and Mrs. Senator put the chicken and banana bunch on the ground, clasped their hands and bowed. Dear grandparents. Ms. Senator hid behind her parents and also softly said hello. Mrs. Elder put down her chopsticks, nodded and replied, I don't dare, then told Mr. New and his wife. You two sit and play. Seeing Ms. Senator standing in a dark corner, Mrs. CA asked. Is this Ms. Senator? Her, yes, was overshadowed by Uncle New's words. Yes. I would like to come up and say hello to my grandparents. Do you have a child? Hurry up. Come on, bring me here so I can see. Ms. Sen was timid and scared, holding her child close. Mrs. Elder raised her hand to welcome the baby and asked. How high is it? Bam, I'm only 14 months old. Mrs. CA picked up the baby in her arms, looked at Mr. CA, and said, Hey, he's too heavy. She turned the baby's face, looked at it and chatted with it for a few times. Then suddenly she wrapped her arms and hugged the baby tightly to her barren side, causing the silk shirt to stretch tight on her flat chest and withered breasts. The baby cried out in fear and tilted his head back. Mrs. CA coaxed. Be good, I'll give you this. She picked up a piece of beans from the tray and brought it to the baby's mouth. But he cried even more and struggled to reach out to his mother. Ms. Senator approached. Ma'am, let me carry you. Mrs. CA absent-mindedly lifted the baby and returned it to her mother. I saw a light of desire and desire shining in her eyes. She also told. The baby looks so cute. Ms. Senator happily blushed, picked up her baby in her arms, kissed it, looked at the baby with all the tenderness and pride of a mother, and said, Bam, he got sick last year and kept turning around, only now is it better. She smacked her lips and said cleverly, My family is poor, we don't have a penny or a word, but having to worry about medicine for our children is really miserable. But Mrs. CA didn't seem to hear anything anymore. Her eyes were dull as if she were pursuing a distant wish. She is thinking that she will never know those fears, because she will never be able to hold a child in her arms, to cherish a life in her heart. Never. If only she would trade all her wealth for her child. I saw her body shake, a sigh would escape her lips and then her dry eyes suddenly became blurry like tears. She silently looked at the baby nursing her engorged breasts in her mother's bib. At that time, Mrs. Senator asked permission to leave, but Mrs. CA definitely did not accept the ceremony. Mr. New was so scared, he begged and pleaded, but she did not listen, so he forced him to bring it back. And gently said that she had already had many rituals, and did not need to take anything from the poor couple anymore. Then, wanting to show her uncle that she was not angry, Mrs. CA opened the cabinet, took out 2 silver coins, gave them to Ms. Sen, and said, Here, I'll let you take it home and make a shirt for your child to wear. Then come Tet, pick it up and play. Ms. Senator shyly inserted 2 silver coins into the statue's intestines. I was so touched that I couldn't thank Mrs. CA. A moment later, Mr. New and his wife happily carried a bunch of chickens and a bunch of bananas and left. Ms. Senator happily followed, happily celebrating their child as they went. At the end of the work, please support me with the like button and subscribe to the channel to listen to more works.